I want to talk about choosing a guitar rig. So now we have our guitar dialed in, and like I mentioned earlier, the first thing I like to do is really just see what the band's working with before I try to stick my nose in the middle of their business. You know, I want to, hopefully I've listened to, or either I'm familiar with the band because I've recorded them before, which fortunately happens a lot for me, or I've listened to their previous recordings, and or I've checked out videos of theirs on YouTube or whatever, and I have a good idea where they're coming from, but I still want to physically hear, if possible, physically hear what that stuff is in my studio. So I'll have them set up their rig and you know, and check it out, see what I think, and then I'll talk to them about what it is they like about it, and if there's anything they don't like about it or think that they can improve upon, and then we start the long process of auditioning other gear, and I'll pull out. Sometimes I'll pull out other guitars. I have a bunch of guitars around in my studio that I use sometimes, and a bunch of amps and cabinets as well. And sometimes I'll just actually, more often than not, I make a big line of guitar amps and sort of quickly run down a bunch of different guitar amps and try to see, like, are any of these things resonating with you as a guitarist more than the rig that you're currently playing, or maybe I can find something that sort of captures the vibe that they have, but does it in a little better way or a more refined way than what their current rig is doing. You know, once I find that, then, you know, maybe there's like there's usually a lot of discussion about, you know, dialing in, you know, what amp we're going to use, and then what cabinet we're going to use and what speakers we're going to use. Do we want to have something that has a ton of headroom and a lot of you know, I've got some Emperor 6x12s in my studio, which are pretty cool and impressive looking, but having, you know, 6 12-inch speakers means there's a ton of, they have a ton of power handling, and so they're very responsive, which can be a good thing or can be a bad thing. If I want to have like a real like chuggy kind of guitar sound that really has a tight bottom end that is super responsive to the guitar playing, then those can be great if I want that headroom. But a lot of times I want a more sort of compressed, focused, mid-rangey guitar signal. And I try to think about how the guitar fits around the other instruments being played. You know, like, is the bass kind of a guitar-y bass, or is the bass more of a bassy bass? And if that's the case, then even though a ton of bottom end on the guitar sounds awesome in the room and it's fun to play, this guitar with a ton of bottom, does that bottom end work well in the context of a mix? And you know, am I going to end up sucking all the bottom end out of it when I mix it anyway, or should I just try to get it right at the tracking stage? And same thing with the top. You know, a lot of like modern guitar amps tend to have an excessive amount of sizzle that sort of conflicts with the cymbals. So I really feel like more often than not, guitar lives in the mid-range. So sometimes 1x12s or 2x12s actually, while they might not feel as flattering in the room as a, you know, big giant cabinet that pushes a lot of air, in the context of a mix, it can be actually a lot more focused and require a lot less work after the fact. There's also the benefit in recording with smaller cabinets that you know, each speaker within a larger cabinet has a phase relationship to the adjacent speaker. So like if you're recording, you know, if you have a mic on this speaker and there's a mic beside it, electrically, these speakers should be moving together. You know, if you got a mic right here, then, you know, sound from my right-hand speaker is getting to that mic in 1 inch, and sound from the left speaker is getting to that mic in 10 inches or 12 inches or whatever it is. So it will, you know, granted that sound is quieter than this sound, but there is actually like a phase discrepancy. And when you do that with a 4x12 or a 6x12, you have that phase discrepancy coming from all over the place. That's why sometimes you'll see people, especially with bigger cabs, miking them from a distance. So rather than like picking up the sound of one individual speaker, they're really picking up the sound of the full cabinet. And that, you know, that works great for some things and not so great for other things. And I'll pick different mics to use depending on whether I'm miking the cabinet up close or from a distance. And we're gonna get into that in the next little topic. So just to finish up on selecting a guitar amp, what frequently happens after auditioning a bunch of guitar amps is that the guys in the band will say, you know, hey, you know, I really like this element of that amp and this other element of the other amp and then this amp and, you know, that kind of stuff. And I do that myself a lot. Like I'm always, especially when it comes time to make a converged record, I usually have this huge line of amps because I like something about this one and something about that one. And, you know, it's like, well, I love Swedish death metal and I love the Hot Snakes and I, you know, and I want to find the perfect blend between those two things or, you know, but a lot of cases, they just really don't work well together. And that can be a case of a compromise being bad. It's not the two things are so different from one another that rather than complement each other, they just sort of negate each other. So I'd be very careful about blending amps. So it's something that you can do, but I tend to do it on separate tracks so that I can decide that blend later. And more often than not, when I do set up a bunch of amps, in my mix, I usually am paring it down to one or maybe two, where one is heavily favored. So be a little bit careful about blending amps, especially blending amps on the way into your system. Try to keep them separate from each other. But that being said, I do blend amps all the time, and sometimes you really can find a unique sound by blending a bunch of different stuff. But I would urge you, before you resort to that, to really audition not only each amp and trying to find a favorite, but each amp and cabinet pairing that you have at your disposal. You know, some amps just rule out of certain cabinets and sound terrible out of others. And then also, if you dial in an amp for a certain cabinet, when you move that over to another cabinet, you're going to have to redial it in. It's instantly going to feel probably wrong until you redial that amp. So that's my thoughts on selecting a guitar amp. And then once I've selected a guitar amp, then it's time to start miking it. And when it comes time to mic an amp, the first thing you want to do is sort of see what you have in your mic locker, what's available to you, and then what will best work and capture the sounds that you have. Sometimes I take two philosophies in recording guitars when choosing microphones. Like if I have an exceedingly mid-rangey guitar tone, I may want to use more of a scoop sounding mic to counteract the mid-ranginess of that guitar. However, if I have an exceedingly mid-rangey amp that I'm combining with an exceedingly scooped amp, I might actually want to use a very mid-rangey mic on the mid-rangey amp and a kind of scooped mic on the scooped amp to actually further the distinction between the two tones. I find that I can blend two amplifiers together better when they are more different from one another than closer to each other. So I will, you know, some of my favorite microphones for guitar are the Heil PR31. It's a great dynamic microphone, or the PR30. It's essentially the same mic. You know, and that's got that classic sort of 57 sound, but done with a little bit more transparency than a 57. And Bob Heil's a really great guy. I think he makes a great mic, and I've been using that stuff for years. Another favorite of mine, of course, is the SM57. It's just classic, can't go wrong. And if I'm working really quickly, just jam a 57 in front of it, you're good. There's the Royer 121, which of course is a very often used guitar mic and super smooth sounding ribbon mic on guitar. I prefer the passive version of that. In most cases with ribbon mics, I do prefer the passive version. I feel like the active versions are typically too hot and also cost too much. And my recent, speaking of active ribbon mics, my recent acquisition, actually this is maybe the first or second record I used it on, is the AEA N22, which is their new active ribbon mic. It's a cardioid microphone, and it's quite a bit thinner sounding than the Royer mic, but it is sort of the closest mic that I've ever used to a finished guitar sound, actually. And you know what? I can play some audio examples of this stuff. So let me sort of dial in Pro Tools here for a second. So when I was tracking this, as you saw me, I think I actually may have a photo somewhere in here. Yeah, here we go. So these are the mics that I chose to use on this cabinet. This is a Blackstar 2x12 cabinet. It's actually a Blackstar Artisan 30 amp. and there's one Celestion V30 in there, as well as one Weber speaker. I forget which model number the Weber is, but it's one of their ceramic magnet British style speakers. And the Weber actually has something on it called a beam blocker, which is this little sort of like dome type thing that you can, when you're installing the speaker, you install the beam blocker first and then install the speaker in front of it. If you want to just Google beam blocker, you'll find it. But it's this, basically it it makes the speaker baffle almost look like the stencil of the letter O. So there's like a thing that sort of floats in the middle of the speaker that's dome shaped that deflects sound coming off the middle of the speaker and disperses it. So when you're standing in the room with this cabinet, it's not as directional as the average 2x12. A lot of 2x12s are very like straight ahead. And this one's actually open back too, so it really, between the open back and the beam blocker thing, it really throws the sound all over the room, which is great if you're a guitarist and you're standing beside your amp or a little bit above the amp or something like that, you can still hear it. And it's also great if you're at a show and you're in the front row, you don't get that like laser beam treble thing right in your face. It's more of a natural dispersed sound. So I think that what you see here is this is an RCA 44BX ribbon mic beside a Unidyne Shure SM57. And those are on the Weber speaker about a foot back or so. And then the mic beside it is the AA N22 on the V30. And I ended up, this is not my final mic position, I ended up jamming the N22 right up on the grill, and because I felt like it's kind of thin on the bottom, so it really wants to be jammed right up on the guitar amp to sound great. If I wanted to combine the N22 with the other mics, I would have to do a little sample alignment to get them the phase to agree between all the mics, since they're in different positions. But I lined up the capsule of the 57 and the capsule of the 44 along the same plane, so those don't seem to need any phase adjustment. So let's take a listen to, let me just a second here to set up some solo buses. I'm going to go into XOR, which lets me cancel each solo. So let's take a look at Pro Tools on the big screen now. And so since the 57 and the 44 are on the same plane, I'm going to make a group out of those, just a temporary group. And yeah, so now I can toggle those on and off in solo together. And let's see. Yeah, the gain on those things are way down. I'm going to pan those both to the same side as the N22. So I'm going to listen to Guitar 2, which is Aaron. He's playing more like the meat and potatoes type stuff, so we'll probably be able to judge the sound a little bit better with him. And there's a bunch of feedback crap at the beginning. I'm just going to skip over that. Let's get some volume. All right, so you know, my first impulse when I first started hearing the N22 was like, oh, it's kind of thin sounding and a little too crunchy. But and then the 44 and the 57 blend feel more like the classic guitar tone that I expect to hear coming out of the speakers. But what I've found in mixing is that, you know, things tend to just get brighter and brighter over the course of a record. You know, you start tracking, you're listening pretty loud, and when you listen loud, you tend to prefer deeper sounds, and then as you get closer to your finished product, you know, you're not listening as loud, and you end up kind of wanting to brighten things up, and by the time you get to the finished master, and we'll actually see this tomorrow as I go from some examples of raw track through finished master, that things just keep getting brighter and brighter and brighter, and I found that when I was mixing, the N22 actually brought me closer to a finished guitar sound without EQ than the 44-57 combo. But yeah, definitely like in solo mode, that 57-44 combo has that extra sub bass and extra low mid fullness that is a little more ear pleasing to begin with. So let's just take a quick listen one more time. You can hear me toggle between them. Cool. And for those of you listening at home, you're supposed to be hearing this pan to one side, by the way. All right, so that's the difference between those two mics. And let's go back to the slides. Mic placement. I touched on this a little bit before, but sometimes you want to have the mic jammed right up on the grill. Other times you want to have the mic set back a little bit. And that has a lot to do with what type of microphone you're using, how much proximity effect it has. And for those of you who don't know, proximity effect is sort of an exaggeration of bottom end that happens primarily in cardioid mode of a microphone. If you're using an Omni microphone, you usually have less proximity effect. And it's the same is true for figure of 8 microphone. And as you move that microphone closer or further from the source, that proximity effect will change. So if you're miking a guitar cab and you want to either mic get the sound of the full cabinet and not just a single speaker, or if you have an excessive amount of bottom end coming off the cabinet, you might pull your microphones back a little bit. And I found that particularly that 44BX is an exceedingly bass-heavy microphone. So I'll pull that, when I use that microphone, I'll pull that back from the cab at least a foot and aim it right dead center in the speaker, and that's how I get the best sound out of that microphone. So also then, in relation to where you place the microphone on the speaker, you can change your sound a lot. And it's a fun thing you can do if you ever get the chance is to take a day, and actually I do this still. Every once in a while I need to take a day to do audio experiments in my studio and refresh my memory about what are the differences between these different mic techniques and mic positions. And like the overhead thing I did where I was comparing omnis and figure 8s and cardioids, like I need to do that kind of stuff periodically just to keep those variations fresh in my head. So what I like to do on guitar when I'm trying out new microphones or new mic positions or new mic preamps even is to either record a DI guitar and make a loop out of that you then reamp through an amp, or use like a looping guitar pedal and play, like develop a little guitar loop that might have some low stuff and some high stuff, so you have this like repeated performance that you can record the exact same performance over and over again, and then do that performance with, take a mic and then whatever mic you choose and mic it close, mic it far, mic it at an angle, mic it at the center of the cone, mic it at the edge of the dust cap, mic it at the edge of the speaker. Do all this different stuff and see for yourself how that really affects the guitar tone. There's a neat thing I've seen recently, which is like a little guitar mic robot that somebody made that kind of moves the mic around by a joystick, and you can in real time hear how that varies. And there's also some guitar amp plugins that allow you to move the mic around, and that can help you sort of determine how mic position will change based on that. But that's your first source of EQ. Obviously the amp and the player and the guitar and all that stuff is really your first source of EQ, but as an audio engineer, the microphone placement is your first source of EQ. So the closer you can get to a finished product by placing your mic correctly, the less work you'll have to do down the line, and the closer to a finished product you will have as you're tracking, and you'll make better decisions about the tones of all the other instruments all along the way. So do a little experiment, see what you like best for mic positions, or see how mic positions vary, mentally catalog that, and then pull out those tools that you have as various people come through and ask you to record them. So that's with working with a single microphone. But sometimes you might want to use multiple microphones. And when in doubt, a single microphone is always safer, because as soon as you throw 2 mics into the mix, you're welcoming problems. So there's a little thing which I think I'm actually going to play tomorrow in the bass thing, where I did a little demo of one way to do some phase checking between various microphones on an amp, moving them around. You can also do that using some sample alignment, like the Pro Tools has a thing called Time Adjuster that can let you slide around tracks a little bit. Or there's also a company called Little Labs has a device called the IBP, which is an all-pass filter that can let you phase align multiple microphones. But the best way to do it is to really get it right at the source. And the first way that I start is just visually. Like, if you can, take the take the windscreen off the mic and figure out where the capsule really is. Like on a SM7, for example, it's really deep into the mic. It might be 2 or 3 inches in from the edge of the mic, whereas like on an SM57, it's right towards the edge. So if you're using an SM57 and an SM7 on the same cabinet, first thing you want to do is kind of like line up the capsules, and that'll give you the best starting point for time alignment. Again, like I was talking about earlier, when I use multiple microphones, I like to, rather than use 2 similar sounding mics, or 2 similar sounding mic positions, I'll use 2 really different sounding microphones in 2 really different sounding mic positions. And if there's less overlap in tonality between the 2 signals, and actually even further than that, I'll use 2 different sounding mic preamps to capture those 2 different sounding mics in 2 different sounding positions to sort of further the tonal difference between them, which actually makes them have less of a phase relationship between them. It makes it a little bit harder to dial in the phase after the fact, but it's the phase relationship becomes a little bit less important between them. I will typically blend those microphones on the way in if I feel pretty confident about them, and there's kind of 2 ways that I do that. I have a mixing console, so I can run my mic preamps into some channels of my mixing console and then sum them together down to 1 input into Pro Tools, and that sort of means there's fewer decisions I have to make later. If I don't have the confidence about how I want to blend the mics together on the way in, I'll keep them on separate tracks. Or if I'm doing multiple amplifiers, I'll try to keep those on separate tracks as well. If you don't have a mixing console and you choose to blend microphones on the way in Pro Tools, you can basically make yourself, let's say you want to combine 2 mics down to 1 track, you can just make yourself 3 tracks. You will have 2 aux inputs and then 1 audio track. So for the 2 aux inputs, you'll assign your hardware inputs from your microphone preamps. So let's say those are going into inputs 1, 2. You'll assign your aux inputs to be inputs 1 and 2, and then you'll assign the aux outputs to a bus. And you can make your own bus and name it, or you can say, I want to assign each of these auxes to bus 1 out, and then the 3rd track that you've made as an audio track, set the input of that audio track to the corresponding bus of your aux inputs, and that will allow you to digitally control the blend between the 2 microphones and record them onto 1 track. You have to be a little bit wary of imparting some latency into the signal when doing it that way, but if you're set up well, it shouldn't be much of a problem. But I do that in the analog world. Okay, and in addition to close miking the amps, sometimes you might want to have an ambient mic on the guitar amp. Yeah, let's actually, here, you know what? I have ambient mics on this guitar amp. Let's listen to them. I'm going to toggle between close and ambient mic and then play both of them. Okay, so one thing I did with the ambient mics on this particular project, and I don't always do it this way, but when we were done tracking drums, I left the overheads set up on the drum set. And without changing any of the settings on the overheads, I used the overhead drum mics as my ambient guitar mics. And I'll do that with overheads or room mics or whatever on the drum set, and that, I feel, sort of helps impart a feeling that the guitars were played in the same room as the drum set. Sometimes I'll even send the guitar room mics out the same channels for the same outboard processing as the overheads and really make it gel like a live recording. And it's a very small, subtle thing to do, but I think it's those little small details that really give you that sense of being there, and I think it helps with that. The other reason why I like to use room mics for a guitar, actually two reasons. In this case, I'm using a stereo room mic on the guitar, the stereo overheads. Sometimes I'll record bands that just have one guitarist, and we don't always want to double the guitar tracks. So it's nice to have a little bit of presence, like if the guitar is just out of like the left speaker for the Van Halen thing, for example. Like you'll always hear Van Halen records, it's just like left panned rhythm guitar and then some ambience on the right side. That gives you a sense of space on a mono guitar that you wouldn't get if you just had one single mono guitar hard panned. And then a mono guitar sort of panned up the middle sometimes conflicts a little bit too much with the drums, bass, and vocals. So it's nice to pan up the guitar even if it is a mono guitar. So that'll give it a sense of space. So sometimes, I might have one guitarist in the band and they just do the verses or single guitar, and then the chorus is doubled, or maybe there's a guitar break and it's just one guitar happening at any given point in the song. And particularly when you're listening on headphones, like in real life, you never listen to music where you absolutely can hear nothing from your right ear and only hear stuff from your left ear. So having a little bit of room mic, or maybe it's reverb or whatever on a guitar, or maybe it's not hard panning the guitar, a little bit of presence in the opposite speaker can keep you from feeling disoriented when listening to something on headphones. Actually, some of the best headphone amps actually have like a crosstalk feature where it will impart a bit of the right channel into the left and vice versa, so that you don't feel disoriented when you're listening on headphones. It feels more like the experience of listening on speakers. And I think that those things might even put a subtle delay on the opposite channel that it bleeds in. Okay, so room mics. Now, final thing I'll talk about miking is about the idea of running DIs, and then with the interest of reamping or editing. One of the common sort of modern production techniques is to, some people don't use guitar amps anymore, and they just record DIs and use amp simulators. I don't typically do that, but it's nice to be able to see the transients of a guitar signal. A lot of like heavily distorted, like this thing just looks like a giant worm. You don't know what's going on. It's just a bunch of fat waves. But if you had a DI track, I think I actually have a DI bass. Yeah, see, let's zoom in on this bass thing. Can't see it that well, but you can see a little bit more of the dynamic range of the bass guitar in the DI than you can in the microphones. Certainly when comparing the bass, maybe not so much the bass sub channel, but when comparing the bass mic to the DI bass, you can see the attack of things better. So if you feel like you're going to be editing the guitars, if you have a particularly sloppy guitarist, or if you're trying to go for that ultra tight guitar thing and you think you're going to need to edit some guitar performances, sometimes a DI, even if you don't use it at all in your mix, can be a helpful tool to guide you as to where the guitar player is actually picking. I feel as though the whole concept of DIs is a lot about indecisiveness. At least in my studio experience, it's like we don't know if we can get a good guitar sound now, so let's just save that for later, and we'll get a guitar tone later. And a lot of times when I mix records, people will or mix only records, some records I haven't recorded, people will send me DI guitars and ask me to reamp them. And I really try to avoid that whenever possible, because I feel like guitar players and amplifiers interact with one another. You feel a certain amount of air moving off an amp, and different amps respond to you in different ways, and that causes you to change the way that you play. And to perform with a temporary guitar tone is, to me, is kind of like flying blind. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's the best guitar tones I've ever got have not been reamps. They've been a guitar player interacting with their amp and really knowing what it does. And actually, I find that even for like, real organic guitar tones in my studio, I can judge them best when I play the guitar myself. I don't do it exclusively. I have the guitar player in the group play, play their rig, but then if it's not feeling quite right, I'll grab their guitar and just play a little bit and be like, oh yeah, okay, there is like this little weird thing going on that I didn't notice until I started playing, because I didn't, there's like a feedback loop that happens between the player's brain and the amp that you don't have unless you actually experience it for yourself. So, and when you set out with the idea that you're going to DI your guitars and then later reamp them, then you're setting out with the idea to remove that feedback loop from the recording process. But that being said, if you're really indecisive, or if you're recording at home in a place where you're not allowed to make any noise, or you think you nailed it but you're not sure, and you want to just have a safety net, sometimes DIs are cool. I don't do them by default, but if I'm unsure about something, I will record a DI. And I think I only recorded this bass DI in case I wanted to sort of illustrate some amp simulator type stuff with the bass, which I probably won't do. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't even record a bass DI.